1999, the Soviet Union had left. In fact, the Soviet Union didn't even exist. The war against the Afghan Mujahideen was over, and in that war, somewhere between 1 million and 2 million Afghans had died. The Soviets had lost 50,000 men. Hundreds of thousands of Afghans had been maimed by landmines which had been planted by the Soviets, for which, when they left no maps. In the wake of the Soviets' withdrawal, Afghanistan became chaotic. And the Mujahideen, who had defeated the Soviets largely because of the assistance of the West, most notably the US, were now armed to the teeth and simply turned the guns from the Soviets onto each other. Afghanistan was divided into these private fiefdoms, which were ruled by these so-called warlords, who were incredibly powerful people, who had their own private militia. Life in Kabul became hell. It was during those 4 years, between 92 and 96, that Kabul was destroyed. It wasn't during the Soviet war. The Soviets destroyed the countryside, but Kabul was left alone. When the Soviets left, the war came to Kabul. And the people of Kabul watched helplessly as around them, in the mountains around Kabul, the different Mujahideen factions took up position and began shooting rockets at each other, with the people in between caught in the middle. And so 50,000 people died in those 4 years in Kabul alone. And something like 30,000 homes were destroyed. Entire neighborhoods were pulverized. And then in September of 1996, these very disjointed, disorganized Mujahideen groups were defeated by a very unified group of young religious warriors named the Taliban. And when they came, they promised peace and stability. And people welcomed them because people were tired of rapes, abductions, murders, killings, lootings, kidnappings committed with impunity during the warlord years. So when the Taliban promised peace and stability, people said, yes, we're ready. And within a matter of days, it was clear that the honeymoon with the Taliban was not going to last. And soon, news began to leak out of Afghanistan that these guys were imposing an Islamist extremist view on the people of Afghanistan, and there were very, very serious human rights violations happening there. The world pretty much looked the other way. And not to pick on Mr. Brzezinski, but his statement to me reflects the view of the Western world when he said, what's more important in the world history? The Taliban or the fall of the Soviet Empire? A few stirred up Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War? And what this report was talking about was actually very specifically was talking about activities which the Taliban had banned, and it mentioned kite fighting. And I remembered that from my childhood. And so it was that soon after watching that report, I was kind of inspired by it, and I wrote this short story almost overnight about a boy who was raised in privilege, his loyal, affable, loving servant, and between them the love of kite fighting. And it was a good short story, I think. It wasn't a great story. It was a good story. There was something lacking in it, but I felt it had heart, and so I shopped it around a little bit. Eventually, I let it sit. And it sat in a shelf for a couple of years until the March of '01, when my wife dug it out and read it, and then she gave it to her dad, and Mr. Kayumi read it, and then he called me and left a voicemail for me and said, boy, he really loved the story, but he wished it had been longer. And that was when, in March of '01, that the idea occurred to me that maybe the reason I don't like this short story is because it's really meant to be a book. So I began expanding it into a novel in March of '01. And eventually, by June of 2002, the manuscript for the novel was done. And the book was eventually published in June of '03. By then, June of '02, when I finished the book, and I shopped it and found the publisher rather easily, the world had changed. Because those few stirred up Muslims in Afghanistan had housed somebody named bin Laden, who had sent these guys to go and attack the World Trade Center. So there had been a bombing campaign on Afghanistan, the Bonn Agreement, and plans for elections and parliamentary and the constitution. So there was a seed of interest in Afghanistan and matters of Central Asia and the Middle East, and so my novel was picked up quickly by Riverhead in Penguin. And then eventually was picked up by 20 or more countries, including France, for which they published a novel 3 weeks ago, and I went back to France 3 weeks ago, and while in Paris, I looked up my old friend Jacques Chabot, and it turned out that he was still living in Paris. He was gray, and he was a grandfather now, but he had become a prolific author, and he had written these children's stories and actually was working on writing novels for adults, and he'd become this successful editor at a publishing house. And so I told him, he remembered me immediately, and we met up at a cafe and we had a beer. Anyway, I'm gonna stop there. Well, I wanna get to your questions. I want to make sure we have time. I'm interested in knowing your thoughts about this book and your questions for me about the novel, Afghanistan, the writing process, anything I think is fair grounds. So I'll turn it over to you. I'll turn it over to Aaron, who has the mic.
Thank you.
And he's going to go and you're going to
I'll work as kind of a relay for your questions so you don't have to get up from your seat and come over here. So we'll begin the questioning. Did Ali know Hassan was not his son?
You are in a book club, aren't you? The answer is, I've left that ambiguous as many other things, like what happens to the boy. But I would think, knowing him, that he didn't, and that knowing such a thing would have made it very difficult for him to live in our household.
Next question. We'll try from over there. Go ahead, if you can just speak up.
And I wonder how many of the characters are modeled as part of the first story, and those characters that were interior voices, like
Well, the question is about characters who were inspired by people that I know, and then those who really just came from an internal voice. You know, everybody's somewhat sort of based on somebody. I think that's how most of fiction is written, whether it's admitted to or not. For instance, I've known a lot of generals in the Bay Area, people who still kind of live, physically they live here, but mentally they still live in the old country. They've never bothered to learn English. And they shop in Afghan stores, and they socialize with Afghans. And for all practical purposes, they still live there. So I've known people like that. The character of the father is interesting because there are traits of my own dad in him. Certainly the sense of very strong convictions. My dad is not 6'5" like Baba, and he doesn't look like he could rip out a willow tree, but he's got a presence, and he's very well respected, and he's a guy who's got very strong convictions, and he tells you what they are, and he can back it up. And he's somebody that I really admired growing up and looked up to, and in some fashion or other was intimidated by. I always kind of felt like I want to do something to make this guy proud of me. And I don't think that's very unusual in that part of the world, in Afghanistan, or in Iran, or in some Arabic countries, where especially firstborn male children feel this weight of expectation to make their fathers proud. With my mother, I have a relationship altogether different. I'm very, very intimate with her. We're very open, and we have a very kind of relaxed, loving relationship. With my dad, there's always been a matter of etiquette and so on. And that's just the way it is. So the character of Baba is kind of, in some parts, based on my dad. Rahim Khan, I've told you already, and I've also spoken about Hassan. But anyway, that's how fiction is written. We pick bits and pieces of people we know and we create characters.
Go ahead.
How do you see Afghanistan today? What do you think its future is?
I think there are two camps when it comes to Afghanistan. I think there's one camp that says that it's a terrible disaster, that the warlords are running the show still, that the opium trade is out of control, that the infrastructure is nowhere near being repaired, that most people are living in poverty, that life expectancy in Afghanistan is like 43 years old, that it has the highest infant mortality rate in any country in the world. And then there's the other camp that says, look, it's only been, less than 4 years since 9/11. And in those 4 years, there's a new constitution. There have been presidential elections. We have parliamentary elections coming up in September. A woman ran for president. Women are back in the workforce in many parts of the country. Girls are going back to school. Roads have been rebuilt, and so on. So it's great. The truth is always in the middle. And both of those things are true. And so it's, I think, largely a work in progress. You'd have to say the jury's out. Nevertheless, you have to be encouraged by some of the things that have happened there. I hesitate to criticize and to be very harsh and say, well, look at what's happened. Because it's easy, but I think that kind of undermines the efforts of people who are there working very, very hard to make things happen. And it doesn't credit them with the wonderful things that have happened. I think having held elections in which they had 10 million people registered, 40% women, is a big deal. That speaks volumes to me as to what the Afghan people want. And having had, even whether it was symbolic or not, having had a woman run for president is a big deal. It's a big deal to have a constitution that says it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman, you have equal rights. Is that practiced? No, not yet. Of course not. But it's there in paper, on paper, and that's the law of the land. And that's very, very important. So I'm cautiously optimistic about Afghanistan, but if the US were to pack up all of its troops from Bagram and get on a B-52 and fly back home, how long would the government last there? a week, back to chaos. So that's why it's important to have the support of the international community, specifically the U.S. I met people there, and this one guy, I think, summed up to me the view of most Afghans, the average people living there. I think sometimes there's a notion that Afghans really want the foreigners to leave, specifically the Americans. And although nobody really, it's true that Afghans are very sovereign people, and they've never looked kindly on a foreign military presence on their land. This is different, and I think that notion is a misconception. This guy said to me, there are two things I pray for in the morning. One is for the health of my children. The second is for the Americans to not leave. And that to me spoke a lot as to how terrified those people are of a return to the chaotic days of 92 to 96.
Next question.
How are you going to overcome the current first novel?
You know, I thought about that when I began writing my second novel, and I felt self-conscious because the shadow of the kite runner loomed large. And so, but frankly, now I'm 4/5 of the way through a first draft, and I'm so involved in that book that it's hard for me to even think of things in those terms anymore. It's kind of like having a second child. You know, you realize that your second child has his or her own personality and charms and little shtick and things that they do. And so you learn to appreciate them for what they are. And so the second novel is coming along, and it's really, I feel, stepped out of the shadow of the kite runner, and it has become its own beautiful thing. And so I'm very, very proud of how it's turning out. It's set in Afghanistan, and it deals with an issue which I didn't deal much with in the Kite Runner, which is the division, the gender division in Afghanistan. And so it's a story largely of women there in Kabul. But that's a very broad stroke kind of description of that book. The things that interest me are not the big political issues. I'm always very interested in human issues, personal entanglement, and people's betrayals and their reconciliations, their regrets, their fears, their compassion, their transformations, and so on. Those are the things that interested me in the Kite Runner, and those are the things that I'm writing about in the second book as well. So
we can take one more question.
Are you still pursuing your medical career, or are you going to sit your day down?
Medical. Well, I love medicine. I really do. I can't say that I have always loved medicine. And I have to be honest, I chose medicine very rationally. It was a decision that I made. I was going to be a doctor, and I pursued it. And I became a doctor, and I was good at it. But the first 2-3 years, I was really afraid that I had made a big mistake. That I had done it for reasons that didn't have a whole lot to do with me actually loving the profession. And then what happened is that eventually I began to really like it. And I began to see people trusting me with their health, the health of their children, their grandchildren. There was one family I was taking care of 4 generations. And so, several years later, I really began to appreciate medicine. And the analogy that I've used in the past has been that for me, the affection, the love I found for medicine is like the affection that forms between two people who've had an arranged marriage. Whereas writing for me, it was like marrying a high school sweetheart. So I probably the last year that I've been in practice has been my happiest year as a doctor. And very fulfilling for me, very rewarding. And I've really loved it. But it became a matter of I simply couldn't make time to do both anymore. This year I had a lot of traveling planned and a second book due, and I just couldn't do both anymore. So I went on sabbatical as of December 1st for 1 year, and I put the medical practice on hold for 1 year. So now I'm really a living writer. Thanks. Oh, thanks.
The dashing Khaled Hosseini.